Well, a very good evening, everybody. If you would, get your Bibles out and open them up to Acts, the 10th chapter. Acts chapter 10, that's where we're going to be tonight, and who knows, maybe even for several weeks. We were in Acts chapter 9 for several weeks, and I was glad that we spent that time because that's just a wonderful chapter of the Bible, and Acts chapter 10 is going to be, in a lot of ways, equally as exciting because of the great things that happen here. So get your Bibles out and be ready to follow along in that passage, and we may reference a couple other passages along the way. And if you got comments, if you got questions, if you have observations or things that you might want to bring out that would help to apply the teachings of Acts 10 to our lives, definitely by all means bring those things up. And I'm going to keep an eye here on the live chat for folks who might be watching at home, and I know we got folks that watch remotely from even other towns and other states, and we're grateful for that. And as always, let's work together tonight. We come to Acts, the 10th chapter, which is kind of a nice, clean starting point. I don't need to give a whole lot of background to catch us up to where we are. The events that take place in Acts chapter 10, they in many ways represent the completion of God's will and God's desire and God's plan that really began all the way before the foundations of the world. And that is God's plan to bring salvation to all people. And Acts chapter 10 is going to see that kind of fully and officially be made open to all and be made available to everyone. God's design and God's intentions for the church never involved just being Him and the Jewish people, just this select group of people who were descendants of Abraham. That was never God's intention. Having said that, that is what many people who were Israelites and Jews, that is what they wanted. That is what they tried to make happen. In fact, even as Christianity is beginning to branch out and to start to reach other people, there are many Jews who are trying to stand in the way and prevent that from happening and being opened up to everyone. But this is God's intention, what we are reading here in Acts the 10th chapter, and I am reminded of that prophecy. In fact, I began by reading those very words in Isaiah the 2nd chapter a couple of Sunday mornings ago as we began our worship. And that is that God's plan involved all nations flowing to the mountain of the Lord. Isaiah 2, verses 2 and 3. Acts chapter 10 is going to see that happen. We sometimes refer to this chapter. There's sometimes little headers that are given. Maybe even in your Bible you'll have little headers. And sometimes we kind of label this chapter as the first Gentile convert. And I understand what we mean by that. And in fact, I've probably even said that before in describing Acts chapter 10. But that's a little bit misleading. Because we've already had some Gentile converts, have we not? If you've been reading along in the book of Acts, then you know that there are Gentile people who have converted and become Christians. We've read, for example, in Acts chapter 6, there's mention of those 7 men who were appointed over the work there with the with the women there, the widows there in Jerusalem. One of those men was a man by the name of Nicholas, who it said was a proselyte. So the implication there is here's a Gentile man who proselyted to the Jewish faith. And then somewhere along the way, he then heard the gospel and became a Christian. So that guy underwent a couple of changes. Then probably most famously would be in Acts chapter 8. And that would be the story of who? It'd be the Ethiopian eunuch. And once again, here's a guy from Ethiopia, not a Jew, but now here he is becoming a Christian. Now, even though he was not a Jew, as in the sense of born as a Jew, I think the implication in Acts chapter 9 is that he also proselyted to the Jewish faith. The fact that he had traveled all the way to Jerusalem kind of indicates that this man probably had become a Jew, and then of course he also becomes a Christian as well. The difference with Cornelius is that Cornelius is not a proselyte to the Jewish faith. Cornelius is a Gentile. He is a Gentile that has not yet submitted himself to the rite of circumcision. And that really was kind of the thing that kind of put you over the hump and fully made you a proselyte to the Jewish faith. Cornelius is not somebody that does that. In fact, that's going to kind of be borne out as we work on in Acts chapter 10. And so maybe if we're going to kind of properly title this chapter, we might title it as being the conversion of the first uncircumcised Gentile. That probably would be the better way to describe Acts chapter 10. Having said that, though, this is a marvelous story. And I think I said this last week as we were closing. In many ways, our story kind of begins here because as best I know, everybody that's sitting in this room is Gentile. I don't know of anybody here. Maybe you've done some Ancestry.com work and found that maybe you do have Jewish lineage and heritage, but I'm going to guess that most of us here tonight, and probably even folks that might even be watching at home, are probably our Gentile background. And so we look at a chapter like Acts chapter 10, and we are most thankful for the events that take place here. So let's just read a little bit about this guy. Acts chapter 10, verses 1 and 2 gives us the introduction to this man. Verse 1, at Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of what was known as the Italian Cohort, a devout man who feared God with all his household. He gave alms generously to the people, and he prayed continually to God. Now, really everything that we know about Cornelius, at least as far as background and all those sorts of things, really are found just in these first couple of verses. We kind of pick up some things about his character as we move throughout the rest of the chapter. But what we're given here, this little brief biographical sketch, it's pretty good, isn't it? I've noted from Acts 8 and 9 and 10 that we've got kind of these three consecutive stories about really sincere people. Man, the Ethiopian man, that guy's just got all kinds of sincerity working. Saul, even though he was wrong about some of his convictions and ideas, he too was very sincere. But this guy here in Acts 10, this is Mr. Sincerity. Look at all the things this guy's got going on for him. First of all, we're told a little bit about his occupation, the fact that he is a centurion in the Roman army, a part of the Italian cohort. Of course, being a centurion probably indicates that he was in charge of about how many men? Probably about 100. Now, I did a little bit of study about just the term centurion, and initially that is what it meant, is a man who was a captain of 100. It seems as if over time, though, especially in the Roman militia, that kind of evolved a little bit through the years, and it really came to mean maybe somebody who was in charge of maybe 60 to 80 men, and really just the term centurion was just more of a rank and a designation, the way that we have captain and commander and all these different ranks in our military ranking system. Regardless, though, he is a man of authority, is he not? He's got a number of men who are under his charge. And so this says some stuff about how he's a responsible fellow in his workplace. He's also a responsible fellow at home. This guy's a leader in his home. It says that he's a devout man and he fears God with all of his household. We don't learn a whole lot about his wife and his children, although we're going to find out that they end up becoming Christians as well at the end of this chapter. But just that little statement there alone says something about this guy is a leader. He understands about the role of a man, of a husband, and of a father, and what he's supposed to be in that home. Not only is he a God-fearer, but all the people in his household are God-fearers. And I would have you just notice that when it says he feared God, that actually is a term and a designation that was given to Gentile people just like Cornelius, God-fearers. And, I got to thinking, we have lots of terms and kind of labels like that we use to describe people, sometimes people in the church or other religious people. Maybe sometimes those terms and designations are unfair, but we use those terms because we know what they mean, or at least we know what we're trying to communicate to one another. For example, if we say to somebody, oh, he or she is very faithful, a lot of times what that kind of boils down to is, well, that person comes to church regularly. They're there every Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. We maybe say people who are part of the one-cup persuasion. We say, he's a one-cupper. Well, again, that's probably not a really nice designation to make, but it's descriptive, and it kind of describes something about what that person believes and what they practice. That was the way that the Jews viewed this idea of calling people God-fearers. And it does seem to be the term that was given to people like Cornelius, who were Gentiles that were very devout. And in fact, they maybe were very, very near to the Jewish faith, maybe very close to proselytizing and becoming a Jew themselves. They believed a lot of the same things that Jews believed. They believed in the Old Testament scriptures and accepted them as from God. These kinds of people, they denounced idols. Hey, we don't want nothing to do with idols. We're not like, Canaanites and other Gentile people of the past who are worshiping Baal and false gods. He's a God-fearer. We don't believe in all of that. But again, kind of the hang-up or the hump that they had not yet gotten over is they'd not yet committed to this act of circumcision. Cornelius has not yet done that. And of course, Jews, they actually kind of had a spot for people like these in their assemblies. Now, we talked before about the temple in Jerusalem. There was that outer court that was designed for Gentiles, but it is for Gentiles. Hey, you want to come and worship the same God that we worship? We've made a space for you. Now, you can't come into the inner courts and be a part of that with us in a real close kind of setting, but hey, we will allow you to come in here and you can worship God, and you can, of course, you give your offerings in the various, offering boxes and so forth, and we'll accept those offerings. Jews actually were okay with these God-fearers to some degree. Unfortunately, these God-fearers are going to be the source of a lot of the problems between Jews and Christians as we work forward throughout the book of Acts. Because when guys like Paul come into a new town, where's the first place Paul always goes? He goes to the synagogue. And when you go to a synagogue, really in anywhere in first century times, you're going to find Jews, they're worshiping God. But you're also going to find some Gentile folks who have come and they want to kind of hear what's going on. Some of these God-fearer Gentiles. And they want to kind of check it out and see what's going on and maybe even try to participate in that as much as their Jewish counterparts will allow them to. And God-fearers like Cornelius, well, we don't want to lose these guys. We don't want these Christians coming along and pulling them away because after all, one of the things they do, verse 2, they give alms. They are alms givers. They give to our people. And hey, we don't want to run them off. We don't want them over here, kind of on the enemy side. We want to keep them. We want them, their money and, all the other privileges that they might bring to us. We're going to kind of keep them here in our back pocket. And so that causes a lot of the friction that we're going to read about in really the whole last half of the book of Acts. Cornelius, though, is a very sincere man, though. He is a God-fearer. His prayers and his acts of generosity, those things are noted. It is oftentimes wondered if maybe the description here of Cornelius, the fact that he is a centurion in a Roman army, the fact that he obviously has some interest in God, it does cause a lot of people to wonder if maybe this is the same centurion that Jesus had an encounter with in Luke the 7th chapter. Do you remember the story of that guy? The centurion comes to Jesus and he asks Jesus for his help. He has a servant who is very sick and he wants Jesus to come and to heal his servant. And Jesus and that centurion, they have an exchange, they have a conversation talking about authority. And the centurion says, I too am a man under authority. I tell my soldiers to come and they come, and I tell him to go and he goes. That's the kind of power that I wield. I have some authority as well. And so a lot of folks have wondered, is this maybe that same guy here all these years later? He's now popping up, we're putting a name to him, and this is that very same fellow. I'm not inclined necessarily to say that this is that same centurion. I kind of wonder if that centurion had an encounter with Jesus, that maybe some of the stuff that Peter's going to have to come along and teach Cornelius, he wouldn't really need to teach that guy because that guy would have had a personal encounter with Jesus himself. So I'm inclined to believe this is a different centurion. But regardless, this is a man of esteem and renown. Here's a guy that's got respect. He's got respect not just in his family and in the workplace. He's even got some measure of respect amongst Jews as well. What else do you want to say about Cornelius and about his character in those first two verses? Tom? Yeah. Yeah, I'd actually done some reading about the Italian cohort. There's a lot of people that actually believe this is possibly kind of the infamous legionnaires, and that is kind of that special group of soldiers that were designed to they were put on specific detail to take care of the emperor and other high-ranking Roman officials. And these were the kinds of people who could act with swift and deadly force. These are kind of the best of the best. These are the people that, comparatively, this would be like, SEAL Team 6 here in, our parlance in our time. Regardless, as you said, this is a man of some authority and some standing. And that is of interest to me because we're going to see again and again throughout the book of Acts that people of position and rank, they have an interest in the gospel. And that's almost hard for us to believe. I've said before, I believe I have the ability to teach the president the gospel, but I lack the opportunity. I think I could teach him what he needs to know, but I just don't think I'm ever going to have the opportunity. Frankly, I don't think he would ever be interested in me teaching him the gospel. And that's kind of the way I feel like probably a lot of our elected officials and high-ranking people, important people, maybe they feel about spiritual matters and about biblical things. But in the book of Acts, lots of times those are the very people who are interested. Now, that doesn't mean that they always, respond favorably to the gospel. You have people like Agrippa and guys like that later on that they're willing to sit and listen to Paul, and they are interested in what he has to say, even though they never convert themselves. But there are people like Cornelius who, their rank and their position is not a hindrance to them being receptive to the truth and then acting upon it. We're going to see that very clearly here. What else about Cornelius? I should say, in talking about just kind of the importance of these events, we know that this is an important account because we get it repeated for us or get it told to us 3 different times, essentially. Talked about how Paul's conversion must be a big deal because we're told about it 3 times in the book of Acts. Cornelius' conversion is talked about on 3 occasions. Chapter 10 is devoted to it. Chapter 11 is devoted to it. And then kind of in a shorter, briefer, summary sort of way, it's talked about again in Acts chapter 15 when the Jerusalem conference takes place. And so we know that this is an important event. Well, what exactly ends up happening to this guy who is very sincere and has a lot of good qualities about him? Well, verse 3 tells us. Verse 3, about the 9th hour of the day, and that of course is 3 o'clock. That is one of the customary times that people of the Jewish faith would have prayed. So here's Cornelius. He's kind of adopted that himself. All right, if these Jews are praying at 3 o'clock, well then I guess it's important for me to be praying at 3 o'clock. Peter and John were praying at 3 o'clock in Acts chapter 3 and verse 1. He's praying at the 9th hour of the day. And when he's doing that, he sees clearly in a vision an angel of God come in and say to him, Cornelius. And he stared at him in terror. And he said, what is it, Lord? The word Lord there, I'll have you notice, that's not Lord as in the proper name for God. This is the kind of the more generic term for Lord. This is the Greek word kurios, which can sometimes be used to mean a God. But really it's maybe just kind of the idea of master, sir, someone who is over me. He's shocked by what he sees, and so he refers to him as Lord. And he said to him, the angel said, your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. And now send men to Joppa and bring one Simon who is called Peter. He is lodging with one Simon a tanner, whose house is by the sea. Now, notice here about Cornelius and this vision, and I'm going to say something about visions here in just a few verses when we get to Peter, and Peter has his own little vision, and actually it's described in a little bit different way. Notice, first of all, that his prayers and his alms, his good deeds, his good heart, these good qualities about him, they come up before the Lord as a memorial. The language that's used here is actually very similar. In fact, some of the words are the exact same as the kind that we read about, the priestly sacrifices that were offered in the Old Testament. Leviticus chapter 2, verse 2, and other places talk about when those sacrifices were brought by the priest, it was a memorial before the Lord. And so here's Cornelius. He's doing some good things, and they are coming up as a memorial to God. God recognizes them. God honors those things. God is honored by those things. Now, let's be very clear. Does that mean Cornelius is a Christian now? Is he doing some good things? No. He's praying a lot. Maybe even, who knows, for all we know, maybe somewhere in some of his prayers, he was asking God, forgive me of sins that I've committed and help me to be in a saved relationship with you. Does that make him a saved person? No. Got good stuff going on for him. But what that's going to grant him is that good stuff, it grants him the opportunity. God's going to give him the opportunity now to be obedient and to get more information so that he can be saved and he can be brought into a right relationship with him. He's told to send men to Joppa, where he's at in Caesarea. He's about 30 miles away. Joppa is about 30 miles south of Caesarea, summoned for Simon Peter. Of course, we left Simon Peter off at the end of chapter 9 because he's there staying with Simon the tanner. And as we kind of noted very briefly toward the end of class last week, I do think that's kind of maybe intentional. Putting Peter in the house with a tanner, somebody who would regularly be around and be touching and be involved with with things that would be considered unclean to a lot of Jews. He's around dead animals and carcasses and bodies and things like that because of the nature of his job. Maybe that was kind of the Lord kind of, preparing the soil, so to speak, and getting Peter ready a little bit for what's about to happen here in Acts chapter 10. You need to send for him. I want us to notice here, and Carolyn kind of brought this point out a couple of weeks ago, and it's kind of stuck with me. I'd really never given it a whole lot of thought. Notice once again that this angel that is sent from heaven here to give these instructions to Cornelius, the angel does not tell him what to do to be saved. We don't see that. In fact, I'm not aware of anywhere in the New Testament when there are angelic visions or any other kind of heavenly vision of this sort where people are told by either God Himself or some other manifestation from God that, hey, this is what you need to do to be saved and to become a Christian. That always is the job of people. The angel is going to kind of assist here. You think about it in Hebrews where we're told that angels are ministering spirits. They serve on our behalf. Here we're seeing an angel kind of doing some serving and helping. He's getting Cornelius, getting him to the right place and getting him to the right people so that he can then receive the other information. But I do think that's kind of a critical point for us to notice because sometimes there are people in our religious world today that believe that the things that they are told to do, particularly as it pertains to salvation, somehow come from divine revelations. But that really seems to be the opposite of the way things worked in the Bible. Angels and people like them, they're given some instructions, but never instructions on how to be saved. Peter's going to come and give the information on how to be saved. Peter's the evangelist, not the angel here. Other thoughts on the angel and Peter, or angel and Cornelius, the encounter there? That's right. I'm going to talk about this a little bit in the sermon Sunday night. There's some passages in Romans chapter 3 that talks about how, the law, the Word of God was initially given to the Jews, and they were to be, they were given the oracles of God, and they were designed to be stewards of that Word, and in a lot of ways, they had failed at that. And I'm going to probably make that same point that, many times, we've been entrusted with those same riches. We've been entrusted with the Word of God, and how often do we allow precious opportunities to slip through our hands? We don't step in when we know that we should, when doors are clearly open for us, or maybe sometimes we pray for doors of opportunity, but sometimes we need to go looking for doors of opportunity and seeking out those chances. There's a time and a place for us to interject and to do our work as being evangelistic people. Tom? That's right. Sincere people, and God's able to see, a sincere heart, way clearer than we can. It's not to say that we can't see sincerity, but God's able to see, direct X-ray vision right in and to see how sincere a person is. And when He finds truly sincere people, He is going to work with those people, and He is going to give them the opportunities that they need and work with them. And Cornelius, in a lot of ways, after Acts chapter 10, Cornelius is going to kind of walk off the stage, and we're not going to really know anything else about him. But I got to tell you, we're going to see some things about Cornelius in this chapter that leads me to believe that guy, he probably was a major force for the gospel in the first century. This guy is so evangelistic before he even becomes a Christian. I have to believe God continues to use that guy as a vessel of His own. I mean, he's not a vessel in the same sense that Paul would be, but he would be used in a powerful way for the Lord and for the furtherance of His kingdom. I have no doubt about that. What else about down through verse 6? Well, so he's been given some instructions by this angel. And I'm going to submit to you that really at this point, this is a test of faith for Cornelius. We see some things in those first couple of verses that leads us to believe that, this guy, he's a believer. He's a strong believer. But right here is where the rubber meets the road. All right? Are you really a believer? Because a real believer now is going to take the words that this angel of God has brought you, and you're going to follow through with them. You're going to actually follow through with the instructions. You're actually going to get you some people. You're going to send for 30 miles away and have this guy come? Again, that's not like an easy task in and of itself. That's something that would take a few days to go and retrieve this guy. In fact, you got to take it on faith that that guy is going to actually be in that house that you've been instructed to go to. Are you going to believe? Well, to Cornelius' credit, he does believe. So verse 7. Verse 7, when the angel who spoke to him had departed, he called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier from among those who attended him. Having related everything to them, he sent them to Joppa. It is interesting to note here, we actually get kind of 2 tests of faith like this in this chapter. Cornelius gets this vision, and he's told to do some stuff. Cornelius, do you believe? Are you going to do it? He passes the test. Peter, kind of in another sense, he's going to get a vision, going to be told to do some stuff. Peter, you going to believe? You going to follow through? Of course, we'll see that Peter ends up following through as well. We are impressed by, or at least I'm impressed by this, not only the fact that Cornelius is obedient to this vision, I'm also impressed with how easily he is able to convince others, these servants and this other fellow soldier, these guys who, they didn't see the vision, they weren't privy to that, they didn't get to see this awesome, magnificent presence of an angel of God, but he's able to convince them that those events did happen, that it is credible, and they then obey the words of their master, and they then follow through. It just says something about, once again, about the reputation that Cornelius obviously had with others and the influence that he had. Here he is, he's putting it to work. He's not even a Christian yet, but he's already putting his influence to work in a positive way. What else is there to say here about these first 8 verses? One of the thoughts that did occur to me was who else is actually, at least from if the timeline all matches up, who else is in Caesarea at this point? Who was it at the end of Acts chapter 8 left here and wound up in Caesarea? Yeah, Philip. And of course, later in the book of Acts, we're going to find that Philip is still in Caesarea. And so we have a lot of reason to believe that maybe Philip settled in Caesarea and maybe was there for kind of a prolonged period of time. Maybe, for all we know, maybe until the day that he died, for all we know. Which kind of got me to thinking, if Philip is in Caesarea, why didn't the Lord just use Philip? I mean, he's right there handy, right here in the same town as Cornelius. For all we know, they maybe had even bumped into each other a time or two before, maybe down at the synagogue or something like that. Why not use Philip for this important job of bringing the gospel to the Gentiles? Well, even as I've thought about that, I don't have an answer. If Philip was there handy, I don't know why the Lord didn't use him. But I'll tell you what I do know. I do know that Jesus told Peter in Matthew 16 and verse 19 that I'm going to give you, Peter, upon your confession, I'm going to give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And of course, we've already seen Peter kind of use those keys to unlock the door of those gates to heaven to the Jews in Acts chapter 2. And Peter's going to be used again here in Acts chapter 10 to kind of put those keys to work, metaphorically, to open those gates and open up the floodgates fully and entirely now for the Gentile people. Maybe that's what's going on here. Yeah, there's Philip, and there maybe was even other Christians that could have been used, but this is specifically something that Jesus had worked for Peter to do. Tom? That's right. That's right. And that's actually the very next thing. Anybody want to say anything else about verse 1 through 8 before we start looking at the vision? Yeah, yeah. I think you're right as well. And, we're going to see here in these next few verses, Peter's going to have to make some dramatic changes in his thinking. Even though Peter is, he is kind of the forefront apostle. I don't know whether necessarily we'd want to jump so far as to say that, he's necessarily the most mature, because Peter's failures are many, and we're always quick to note those things. But he certainly is kind of out front. But he himself is going to have some shifting in his thinking. And if Peter's got to have some shifting in his thinking, then that probably also says as well that all the other apostles would have had to kind of have some shifting in their thinking as well. And so let's actually talk about what is that shift in thinking. Verse 9. So the next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter, so now we're here in Joppa, Peter went up on the housetop about the 6th hour to pray. Very pious Jews, they would also pray not just at 3 o'clock hour, but people like Peter, they also had appointment praying time at noon. That's what time of day this would be. And we maybe even wonder about, the idea of going up on the rooftop to do that praying. Of course, the roofs in Palestine, first century Palestine, would look a lot different than ours today. Ours have the, pointed triangular shaped type roofs mostly. But they would have had kind of flat style roofs. And on top of that, lots of people, since it was flat and you could actually walk around up there, they would actually just make little awnings up there. So you'd have some shade. So you'd have some privacy, and then you'd have some shade to be able to kind of keep the sun from beating down on you. It's kind of an opportune place to be able to have some quiet time to be able to pray. And so that's what Peter's doing there, verse 10. While he's praying, he becomes hungry. The Greek word there actually is much stronger than the way the English describes it. He is very hungry. I mean, his stomach is just a gurgling and a gargling, and he's ready to eat. And usually when it gets around noontime every day, I'm ready to eat as well. He became very hungry, and he wanted something to eat, but while they were preparing it, he fell into a trance. Now, let me just stop off right here before we look at the vision itself, and let's just say something here very quickly about the difference in wording, because this is a different word, it's a different term than what was used to describe what Cornelius had. Cornelius, what he had was described simply as a vision, and this, on the other hand, was described as a trance. Now, I'm certainly not in a position to try and differentiate all the nuances between those two terms. However, a vision, just the word itself, perhaps means seeing something while still being kind of fully cognizant of your surroundings. In the case of Cornelius, he was praying. It's not like he was, in the middle of sleep and this is just a dream. No, he's praying. And then the text even said there in verse 3 that the angel came in and said this to him. So maybe there was this, a very visual manifestation of this angel before him, something that would be very physical to his eyes, that he was able to see this. Trance, on the other hand, the Greek word literally means a displacement of the mind. And maybe what this would call to mind would be something more like kind of almost like an out-of-body experience. It's not that Peter's necessarily asleep, because he himself is, he's been praying, and I don't know, sometimes people talk about when you're hungry, sometimes your mind doesn't really kind of work entirely lucidly like it should, but I'm not really sure that that's really at play here. But he has kind of this out-of-body experience, if you will, in seeing this trance. Well, what exactly is the trance? Because it is, this is a very unique trance. We don't see anything else like this in all of the Bible. Verse 11, and he saw the heavens opened, and something like a great sheet descending, being let down by its four corners upon the earth. And in it were all kinds of animals and reptiles and birds of the air. Animals there really is the suggestion there is of like creeping beasts of the ground. Then reptiles and birds of the air. The kinds of animals that are obviously being described here, if you wanted to kind of put some specific animals kind of in the picture in your mind, read Leviticus chapter 11. Because there's a whole bunch of animals that are kind of specified there in Leviticus chapter 11 under the old law. Animals that would be considered unclean. Animals that you're not supposed to be eaten if you're a Jew. It's not kosher to eat those kinds of animals. These are the kinds of animals that Peter is seeing being let down in this sheet or this blanket, huge blanket upon the earth. Verse 13. And there came a voice to him. And the voice said, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." Those of you that are hunters and you like to hunt for food, here's your verse. This is your verse that gives you authority to do that. This is maybe even a verse if you have conversations with folks. I know this really isn't the point of the text, but you have conversations with folks about how, it's inhumane or somehow it's wrong or it's sinful, to kill animals for food. I just point them right here to Acts chapter 10, verse 13. This is the voice of God, not just once, not twice, but 3 different times is going to tell Peter it's okay to eat. isn't the only place, but there's other verses in the New Testament you can make this point, but here's an easy place to make that point. You can eat these animals. These animals that you have considered unclean for all of your life. These animals that Jews for the last 1,500 years have considered unclean. You can kill. You can eat those animals. Verse 14, look at Peter's response to that. Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." Verse 15, then the voice came to him again a second time. "What God has made clean, do not call common." Verse 16, this happened 3 times, and the thing was taken up at once to heaven. So what do we got going on here? You got Peter, he's very hungry. And furthermore, here is a man who he has now been given permission to eat all these animals that he is seeing, in this vision before him. And you have to wonder maybe if throughout Peter's life, when he sees, a pig or some other kind of animal that maybe Gentiles would eat, you'd have to wonder if maybe, he kind of got tempted from time to time. Oh my, I'd sure like to know what that tastes like. They seem to think that it's pretty tasty and pretty wonderful. Regardless, he never has. Peter makes the point, never any time in my life have I ever eaten this, and now the voice of God is saying, you do have permission to eat this. And I want you to just think about that practically now. We are now 3, 4, 5 years or so now into the Christian age, the church age. And here's Peter. He is still a very observant Jew. Even though he is a Christian, and even though those things and those rights pertaining to the law of Moses, they no longer apply to him, he still is carrying on with some of the customs and some of the rituals of the Jewish faith. And that's just kind of another reminder once again that there was not just this immediate clean break between Judaism and Christianity. Here's even an apostle of the Lord, still observing Jewish things like the dietary laws. And what that means is that means that since he has went this amount of time without eating those kinds of in his mind, unclean food, that means that he has some very different views about people who do eat those kinds of foods. And of course, Gentiles, we'll partake of those foods. We'll partake of the beasts of the field that the Jews aren't allowed to eat, and the reptiles and the birds, certain kinds of birds that they weren't allowed to eat from. We'll eat from those fully. Well, Jews had developed in their mind, those people are unclean. Because of the fact, especially, that they're eating those unclean things, we're not going to be associating with them. We're not going to be involved in, sitting down at a table with them and eating dinner with those folks. I want you to notice in this vision, and this is sometimes where we kind of maybe make a mistake in our thinking about what the purpose of this vision is. There's nothing in the vision about baptistries or about whether or not these Gentiles can be Christians yet or not. That's not really the first hurdle that has to be overcome. The first hurdle that's going to have to be overcome is whether Peter is going to be willing to go and sit down and associate with a Gentile. And that is the message of this vision, to get Peter to see that those people, God does not see them the way Jews see them. God does not see them as being unclean and you should have nothing to do with them and they're no good and they can never have any kind of share or fellowship in my family. And so this vision really is a test, and it's asking Peter, will you be willing to associate with Gentiles, people that you have considered unclean? Now, Peter doesn't get that yet, but that is the message of this vision. Are you going to be willing to give Gentiles full opportunity, full participation in the kingdom, and count them as equals instead of counting them as kind of, subhuman? Again, the Jews, we'll accept a guy like Cornelius kind of, as a God-fearer, but he's still less than us. He's not fully one of us. He can't come all the way into the inner court to worship. But in the church, in the kingdom of Christ, that's not the way it is. There's not these layers. We're all on equal footing. And so this is a test for Peter to see whether he will have that kind of proper attitude toward these Gentiles. In a lot of ways, what you see there in verses 13, 14, 15, 16, is you are seeing there the law of Moses being made obsolete. I think about what's said in Hebrews chapter 8 and in verse 13, that old law, it would be made obsolete. And in fact, the Hebrew writer talks about, at that time when he wrote the Hebrew letter, that it is soon to vanish away. It is soon to disappear. Here we start to see some of the beginnings of the obsolescence of those old laws, things pertaining to eating and what you can and what you can't eat and those sorts of things. There's a shift taking place here. What else do you want to say about the vision and the things that Peter sees and what he's supposed to get? Well, I'd like to think that if the other Jews, if natural-born Jews were ever going to accept a proselyte, then they would have to accept the dietary laws. I mean, if they're going to demand, circumcision and all these other things, then absolutely the dietary laws would have to be one of them. Yeah. Yeah. He maybe would have. Yeah, actually, the picture that I've included for the folks watching on the live stream, the picture of the blanket, the kinds of animals it's got in. It's got giraffes and elephants and snakes and hippopotamuses, and I'm sure there's somebody somewhere in the world that has tried the meat of those various animals. I've had a little bit of alligator one time, alligator jerky. I thought it was okay, but it's not something I'd want to just sit and chew on probably every day of the week. But there would have had to have been some changes that would have had to have been made. And the fact is, Peter, here's the interesting thing about what God does with Peter here. When Peter refuses the first time, when he says, "Hey, Lord, I can't eat that. I've never touched the stuff before." I want you to notice that God doesn't force Peter to violate his conscience. Peter makes note that, hey, I've got a problem. My own conscience won't allow me to. God doesn't force him to. But what God does do is God does kind of keep nudging him and giving him some more information so that he can retrain his conscience. Sometimes people have issues of conscience about things that really are irrelevant to God. And when they come into some new information, do deeper study and have greater learning, maybe they get around other people who are able to kind of help them see some things that they hadn't saw before, then their conscience is able to be, changed over time. And the Lord is trying to help Peter to change his conscience and his way of thinking. Not just about the food. Again, it's not so much about the food. It's about what that represents and about his attitude toward Gentiles, associating with Gentiles, going into the house of a Gentile, which once again would have been something I'm guessing Peter probably had never done in his life prior to Acts chapter 10. The idea of stepping into the house of a Gentile man and being a guest there and associating in a social capacity like that. That's a big change that Peter's going to have to make. We talked a lot in Acts chapter 9 about how Saul of Tarsus went on the road to Damascus when that happened. And he's got those 3 days there in Damascus in the quiet and in the darkness. I mean, he was having to rethink a lot of stuff. Well, right here in the matter of just the afternoon, Peter is having to process a lot of stuff and is having to rethink a lot of his prior convictions and where exactly all of those things are leading to. And that is where verse 17 picks up, because Peter is inwardly perplexed. He continues to think about these things, and ultimately he finally does arrive at the conclusion, but we're going to have to hold that until next week. I'd like to put verse 17 kind of as our pickup point. There's about a minute or so left on the clock. What do you want to say on these first 16 verses, Carolyn? Sure. Yeah. Oh, no, and if I don't know if I gave that impression about anything. Absolutely not. No. In the case of Cornelius, again, he's not a full proselyte. He's the God-fearer. People who want to fully proselyte, absolutely. A Jew is going to expect you follow all this stuff. You need to keep every bit of it. And unfortunately, that sometimes even included those Jewish traditions, those things that were not bound by the law of Moses, but those things that over time had almost become law in and of themselves. By the time of the New Testament, if you wanted to proselyte, you had to take the whole kit and caboodle, every single bit of it. And who knows, maybe some of those tradition things, maybe were some of the things that kept, a guy like Cornelius from actually fully getting over the hump and fully converting to it. What else? All right, I'm going to put verse 17, and we'll pick up there next week and look at how Peter kind of ultimately arrives at the conclusion that he needs to. And then we'll look at the sermon that Peter preaches on this occasion and the wonderful results of Cornelius and his household becoming Christians. And actually, we're going to see as well, it's not just his household. It's a whole bunch of people there. We'll pick that up next week.